This is actually perfect timing after Miriam's talk, because what I am going to look at for the next 20 minutes is specifically, as you see in the top right-hand corner there, the TREAT-NMD network, which is now known as the TREAT-NMD Alliance. So I'm quite, where's my little clicker? I have to confess that I'm a complete newbie to the world of ciliopathies. The project that I work on a day-to-day basis up in Newcastle is the USAID Joint Action, Working for Rare Diseases. And USAID is one of these dreadful EU acronyms, and it stands for the European Union Committee of Experts on Rare Diseases. So my work doesn't focus day-to-day on any particular disease area. This is a project that looks at rare diseases generally and tries to kind of tie up expertise and healthcare policies across Europe. But today, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the TREAT-NMD network. And the reason I'm talking about this is because it's actually coordinated out of my office, out of the muscle team, which is part of Newcastle University. So the idea is to kind of show people what an alliance of different stakeholders can actually achieve in other rare disease fields. So a lot of you will probably know this, but just very, very briefly, I want you to know what neuromuscular diseases are all about, because these obviously are the conditions that the TREAT-NMD project was set up to help. So these are all rare conditions. They're mostly genetically inherited conditions, although some of them are autoimmune. And there's a tremendous number of these conditions. You have sort of varieties like muscular dystrophies, which themselves encompass a whole group of diseases with different subsets. And there's a tremendous variety in terms of when these things appear and how severe they are and the prognosis. But what unites them all, unfortunately, is that they are all progressive, muscle-wasting conditions, and currently they're all incurable. And the problem can be one of two things. Sometimes it's the muscles themselves that just don't work because of some sort of genetic defect. And the proteins, for example, that make up the muscle tissue are not created properly or not created in sufficient quantities or qualities. Sometimes the problem is not with the muscles are actually fine. The problem is with the nervous system. So the nerves are not carrying these messages from your brain down to your muscles to tell you to, kick your leg in the air or to clench your fist. So the project itself was set up not to focus on any single neuromuscular disease, although in practice, because it was coordinated from my team up in Newcastle, a lot of the attention has focused on Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So Duchenne muscular dystrophy, very quickly, is a rare condition. It affects almost only boys, about 1 in every 5,000 male births. We've known about the gene that causes the problem for quite a long time, since the mid-80s, but actually it's only very recently, sort of almost 30 years later, that we have, I think, 2 treatments which have conditional approvals, with more pending. So again, this is a really progressive disease, it's incurable, and it's a devastating condition, as a lot of these neuromuscular diseases are, just as the ciliopathies. For Duchenne boys, typically the traditional story is you would be wheelchair-bound by your early teens, and often life expectancy was not beyond the teens. Things are getting slightly better. Steroids are now kind of standard go-to treatment, and they are enhancing the number of years that boys are able to be ambulant. So what actually is the project? Well, it was set up back in 2007, and as you heard from our previous talk, there was a great big grant of EU funding. They got about 10 million euros, I think, to start this project off. And it's called a network of excellence. All that means is that's a particular funding mechanism that the EU used to have back at that time. And they set up many of these networks of excellence in different fields, not just medicine. And the idea is that these things would be bid for by groups that felt that they could collaborate in terms of expertise and knowledge and experience, and that they could bring extra added value by working together across Europe. So it was set up back in 2007 through an alliance of many different stakeholders. And I think in some sense, the neuromuscular field recognized quite early on the absolute crucial importance of having all different stakeholders working together, which is something that we've been hearing all morning, I think, when we've been talking about the different clinics for the ciliopathies. So they had patients, you need patients have the knowledge, they have the expertise. You need academics and researchers to do the basic laboratory work. You need clinicians and doctors. Ideally, you want physios, you want social services. You also need industry. You want industry to get interested and involved, the pharmaceutical industries. And you also want policymakers, the people who make the decisions about how our healthcare is going to be organized. What I will say is that there was a crucial patient push here. Colleagues have told me the backstory of how this came into being. And essentially, it was a couple of large European patient organizations that put pressure on the European Commission to say, look, one of these calls, one of these grants you're offering must be for neuromuscular diseases. We're quite well organized as a community. We've got lots of different organizations working together already. And this is an area of tremendous unmet need. So I wouldn't ever underestimate the importance of that patient advocacy power. And the basic purpose, the overall aim of the TREAT-NMD network, as was essentially to reduce the unacceptable bottleneck that they had in terms of translational research. So what that means in English is that they were quite lucky in the neuromuscular field when TREAT-NMD was created, because there were a number of quite promising preclinical or early stage laboratory therapies, molecules people had discovered or old molecules that seemed to be perhaps beneficial for muscle diseases. The problem was, how on earth do you move these laboratory discoveries into a state where you can find patients and you can organize large-scale studies and clinical trials, to getting right at the end of the extreme, getting some sort of approved treatment or marketable drug. And this huge gap existed in the middle of the neuromuscular community. So the aim of TREAT-NMD was to try and kind of fill that gap, to help get any possible therapies out of the lab and into patients' lives where they can really make a difference. I'm going to skip through some of these points, but essentially I would say that the lesson I've always been told is that yes, we've got these lovely pictures of harmonious multi-stakeholder working, and that's absolutely crucial, but it's not always easy. So this was very much a united, and is very much a united project. But obviously, when you get all these different stakeholders, we're all human, and we all have our own needs. So for the patients, quite clearly, they wanted to get cures or therapies out there into their lives. For industry, it was much more of a materialistic, business-oriented approach. They wanted someone to help them, basically, set up trials to get their products out. So the ultimate goal was the same. It was just a case of recognizing that people have their own agendas. Just before I tell you about some of the tools and some of the successes that the project has achieved, I will say that the EU funding in its previous form is no more. It was funded until the end of 2011. But all the things that the project had achieved, everybody thought it was really crucial to keep this going, because funding nearly always ends, so you have to find ways to take it forward. And the team behind TREAT-NMD have had a really difficult time over the last couple of years trying to patch together funding from all sorts of different sources. And what they've done is they've turned their network into an alliance, more of a sort of charitable status. So they drew up a different governance structure. They have an exec committee. They have a membership charter. You can join as an individual or an organization. And they've actually just in the last week or two set up a Just Giving page, which if you can see from we've got 2 donations so far, a grand total of £37.11. So this is really brand new, and we're hoping that some of our partners and people with money are going to help us invest. So it's very much a patchwork of funding going forwards. So these are all the kinds of tools and resources which the network and the alliance has developed. And I would encourage everyone to have a look at their website. Just Google TREAT-NMD, because even though I know that you are not primarily interested in the neuromuscular field, you are experts in ciliopathies, they have a lot of tools on there which can actually be transferred quite easily, I think, between disease areas, because, you know, by and large, we're all rare or relatively rare conditions. So I'm going to talk about just one or two of these tools that I think hopefully will be of interest to some of you, to try and show you what can be achieved when people do work together on this kind of a scale. So one of the things that the Alliance is most proud of are its care standards. So we just mean basically best practice guidelines that clinicians can use when they're treating patients with neuromuscular disorders. Now these things are absolutely vital. When the project initiated, and I'm sure it's the same for the ciliopathies now, there was a vast inequality across Europe geographically in terms of access to care for neuromuscular patients and quality of care. And actually, it's not just a case of inequality between countries, it's very much inequality within countries. And this is something I think we've all encountered in England as well. You know, there's a very real postcode lottery, I think, still, for many rare diseases, depending on where you live in the country. So that's something that needed to be addressed. It's also very important if you're thinking about preparing yourself for future clinical trials to make sure that all patients are getting the gold standard of care, because otherwise, how can you really compare the results of your potential new drug if you haven't got that level playing field to start from? So what was happening back in 2010 is there was an expert group in the US which was working very hard to produce some very high-level academic consensus guidelines on care standards for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And they produced these. A lot of people from TREAT-NMD were involved, and they were published in very high-level journals like the Lancet Neurology, and a really useful resource. What TREAT-NMD did, which I think was actually a stroke of genius, is they thought, well, okay, these are perfectly comprehensible to experts, but for you and me, and for the patients and their families who want to get involved in their care and take ownership of their care, these things aren't very readily available. So they actually produced a family guide or family-friendly, patient-friendly version in clear English. And they produced this document. They've since produced a similar one for another muscular dystrophy, which is spinal muscular atrophy. And you can download these standards of care, these family guides, on the website. They've been translated into dozens of different languages, and it's actually the most downloaded resource, I'm told, on the whole website of TREAT-NMD. So it's really important. It's a part of their wider outreach program of trying to sort of train the specialists of tomorrow and trying to empower their patients. Another tool that the TREAT-NMD network created, which has been really effective in terms of promoting trial readiness, as they always say, is TACT, which is another acronym. This is the TREAT-NMD Advisory Committee for Therapeutics. And basically, again, this is an attempt to speed up the process from laboratory-based breakthroughs, potentially, through to clinical trials. Clinical trials on reasonable numbers of patients, which obviously is no easy feat with certain rare conditions. So what they do is, if you're an investigator and your team has some promising early results, you can actually take these to the advisory committee, which is a multidisciplinary committee, and they will give you expert, unbiased advice on your proposal, on how you could maybe think about putting this into a trial, on ethical issues, how to make the treatment most comfortable for patients, etc., etc. And this seems to actually have been really highly regarded and very well received by the neuromuscular world. In fact, there are some funding programs now, I believe, which will only accept you for a neuromuscular trial if you've actually been through a TACT review. So it's really gained strong standing. Two more little tools to tell you about. One of them is our care and trial site registry, which was set up by one of the German partners. They had 21 partners in the original project, and this was set up in Freiburg It's basically a registry of all centres all over the EU and now beyond that specialise in neuromuscular diseases, and also a list of individual practitioners, because sometimes people may be expert in these conditions but may not be attached to a specific centre. And this is a really brilliant resource for anyone wanting to do a research project or a study, or for, again, pharmaceutical industries wanting to get involved, because your challenge before that is, if you have a condition that affects maybe 50 people in a country, how do you know where the centres are that are treating these people? How do you know where the experts are? And how do you know where the patients are? So this was one tool that they created to try and ease up this process. And we do get a lot of attention and interest from industry in this resource. It's also very beneficial for the people joining it, because you get to promote what wonderful work you and your centre is doing. You presumably will get, at some point, hopefully, approached to participate in some research. And you also get that collaboration and that enhanced communication that comes from being part of a network. And as of last month now, as of May, they had 280 separate expert sites registered there. And as you can see, that's from 43 countries. The scope has now extended far beyond Europe, which is brilliant. The last thing that I'm going to talk about in 5 minutes is the TREAT-NMD registries. Registries, as I know through my work on the wider EU project, are actually becoming a really, really key resource in the rare disease field. All a registry necessarily is a collection of information or data on people who have the same or similar conditions. And in some cases, it can be defined as no more than an Excel spreadsheet on somebody's computer, or it can be an incredibly complicated IT infrastructure. But what's the point of them? Well, there are lots of benefits we found through TREAT-NMD for patients. We very much try, or the team who coordinates the registries very much tries, to make this a two-way street, because if patients are spending time to give their data to the registry should give something back. So they provide feedback on new research developments and standards of care that patients might be interested in. Patients often report feeling a quite satisfying sense of belonging to something wider, of being somehow in touch with the research community. And again, it's a personal choice whether you join these things or not. It also gives the neuromuscular patients a much better likelihood of being approached as and when clinical trials develop. And of course, there are obvious benefits again to research and industry, and it's just making it that bit easier for people to want to set up studies in this disease area. You know, human nature is that if something's incredibly difficult, you're going to be less likely to do it. But if you really create all the tools for people, and if you spell it out for the pharmaceutical industry, they're much more likely to get involved. So registries tell them, okay, where do I find my patients? They're all in one place. You know, what countries am I going to have to focus my trial around? And every registry obviously has to make their own decisions on this, but the TREAT-NMD registry policy is they collect not just clinical data, but also genetic data, because increasingly, as Miriam was saying, in this new era of genetic testing and genetic research, often potential therapies target not just a genetic defect, but a specific part of the gene that's somehow become faulty. So it's really important for researchers and for trial companies to know exactly what kind of mutation somebody has to try and assess whether they will actually benefit from a trial or not. So this is their model. Very quickly, what they do is they've created a couple of global registries for Duchenne and for spinal muscular atrophy. And they haven't gone to every country in the world and built a new national registry. There were registries existing in a few countries for Duchenne muscular dystrophy before TREAT-NMD came along. What they did do is encourage countries to set up their own registries if they didn't have one. And the next step was then to get them to feed information, all anonymized information, into a central global registry. Not all the information, just some common core essential data elements. I won't go through in too much detail about how patients register for these things, but we can talk about this afternoon or over lunch if anybody's interested. But the point is, we then have this tremendous resource worldwide of global data, which can be accessed by researchers or by people planning studies or natural history studies or trials. Now, data access is guarded very carefully. There's an oversight committee that deals specifically with any data requests. They would never be able to see patient confidential identifiable data, so names and addresses are all withheld. But there's a system in place that lets people feed back to the patients and say, look, you're potentially going to be appropriate to take part in a trial. Are you interested or not? And if you are, then you take it from there. So they've set up this system. This is just the kind of data set that they collect, but that's a bit too specific for now. So this is just a quick map to show you the state of the Duchenne registries before TREAT-NMD. So you can see that we had, the USA was pretty well covered. We had registries, national registries for Duchenne in the UK and in France. And this is the state after TREAT-NMD. This is dating to 2010, so things are even better now. So you can see the benefits by encouraging countries to set up their own national registries for these conditions, by giving them the tools, giving them consent forms, giving them potential IT structures to use, and then combining all of this data into one global database. And you can see that the latest figures, our global Duchenne registry now encompasses 31 countries and 13,500 patients. And our SMA registry, which is a little bit slower off the ground, but already has 2,000 patients from 19 countries. So I think it's really successful and really positive for the future. And the future, of course, has a huge question mark because, as I said, there is no more sustainable funding. It's down to the team now to try and be as resourceful as they can and to keep all of these, I think, really incredible resources and tools going. They've had tremendous success in the neuromuscular field, partially, not entirely, but partially because of TREAT-NMD. So I think there's now something like 43 open studies for Duchenne. There are lots of therapies in the pipeline. There is no cure as yet. It's not an overnight solution. But I think just managing to kind of fill that gap that existed in the middle of that process line between lab-based drug discoveries or repurposing of drugs and actually getting something concrete out the other end, that has been where TREAT-NMD's real success can be seen. And their plans for the next few years are basically to keep doing what they've been doing, to create more standards of care for different diseases, to do more on the biobanking side. But I think ultimately their most important challenge is to reach out more widely beyond the confines of the neuromuscular field to consider the wider rare disease world. Because at the end of the day, rare diseases are all rare diseases. It doesn't matter if it's a muscle disease, if it's a ciliopathy, if it's a rare anemia, we all have something in common. And by trying to look beyond the strict disease boundaries, I think TREAT-NMD hopefully will be able to meet some of these next wider challenges, which involve not just tying up resources nationally or even on a European scale, but increasingly on a global scale. So I hope that there's some hope and it's interesting at least to see what other disease groups are doing as well. And as I say, do have a look on the website, because even though you may not be specifically interested in neuromuscular work, they have created lots of tools that can be adapted and can give you ideas for different areas. So thank you very much for your attention.